just lower the volume and the conversation, and so we can begin our little chat here this morning. I just want to welcome everyone. I hope you all had a great weekend. I can't think of a better way of starting the week than being here at St. A's, the Institute of Politics here in New Hampshire. And again, I'd like to just thank our sponsor for today's little gathering, and that's BAE Systems, that many of you know, a prominent member of the New England Council. And I think if you think of corporate giants here in New Hampshire, and also corporate giants who are just very giving to the community, BAE's in the top of the list. So we're very blessed to have them as a member of the New England Council. Tom Bishop is their ambassador, their representative, who comes to all our events and just does a wonderful job representing BAE. It's been a very busy period for the New England Council for the last couple of months, and we may ease up just a little bit in the next couple of weeks as summer rapidly approaches. For those of you who spend time in D.C., on July 13th, we will be hosting a breakfast with Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, and we hope many of you also will attend that event. Later this summer, in August, we'll be holding our first Capitol Hill Report breakfast with one of the newest members of the New England Congressional Delegation. That is Congressman Seth Maggie of Providence, newly elected in his first term. And of course, as the presidential campaign heats up, you will be getting more notices on candidates who will be coming by St. A's, because this truly is a must-stop for any candidate that's thinking of running for president here in New Hampshire, Politics and Eggs. And to Neil Levesque and his team here, we say thank you for making the Politics and Eggs a must-stop. Today, we're honored to welcome back an incredible leader, not just here for the Granite State, but also for the entire region, and I might add, for our country, and that is Senator Maggie Hassan. Last fall, all of you are aware that she was reelected to a second term after previously serving as the 81st governor of this wonderful state, and she served for 2 terms. Capitol Hill, she serves on several, I don't know how she does it, but she does it, and she does it well. Very important committees, including the influential Senate Finance Committee, where she plays a very important role in shaping policy in an array of critical issues, ranging from tax policy to health care to trade. As a member of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension, or what we call the HELP Committee, she's worked to combat the opioid epidemic and improve mental health services, as well as to ensure that our students are prepared to succeed in the 21st century workforce. We're delighted that she could join us today to give us a little update on some of the key issues before the United States Senate, and also her top priorities for the 118th Congress. As you can see, we're changing things up a bit today. Instead of asking the Senator to deliver a very formal speech, we're going to have more of a conversation. So I have some questions for the Senator, but I hope all of you may have a question for the Senator, and take this opportunity to ask her your question. With that, let's give a warm welcome to the Honorable United States Senator Maggie Hassan.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, so let's just start. Debt ceiling. Spent a lot of time, your colleagues in the House and the Senate, and putting together the debt ceiling. I think there were some Democrats, at least in the House side, probably didn't think that the Speaker would ever get the bill through. He did, by 1 vote, to 218, 217. And there were a lot of Democrats that just said, we will not debate the debt ceiling. It's going to be a clean vote, and it's going to be 1 vote, debt ceiling, and then later we'll address, some modifications, cuts, or what have you. Talk about the debate in the Senate, and were you happy the way it ended? Do you think you could have done better, your party, in holding some of the language in there, or did you think this was the best compromise that we could get under the circumstances?
So, first of all, it's just great to be here, and it's great to see so many friends and meet some new folks, too. this morning, and I am deeply grateful to you, Jim, and Larry, and the New England Council for the work you do and this convening of all of us. Look, defaulting on America's debt would have devastated our economy. It would have been a catastrophe. I think everybody in this room knows that. I agree with colleagues, including some of my Republican colleagues, who believe it is inappropriate to hold the nation's default and the nation's economy kind of hostage in the way that the far right in the House was demanding. Having said that, we have a system that runs on compromise and everybody with different opinions coming together. And what I think the White House and the Speaker, with participation, of course, from the Senate, were able to do was essentially negotiate the budget they would have negotiated anyway, the budget parameters they would have negotiated anyway leading up to September, the end of the fiscal year, while also agreeing not to have the nation default on its debt. And I think that's critically important. I think the fact that we have raised the debt ceiling now for 2 more years is also really important, so that our business people, our families can know that we have a predictable, sustainable, certain economy going forward, at least when it comes to the possibility of a default. And that's really, really important for our economy. I think it's important for the people of New Hampshire and the country. I think all in all, the parameters that they set for the budget are the result of a decent compromise. Do I like everything in it? No, but that's the whole point of a compromise. And now the task is for our appropriators to actually get through these 12 different appropriation bills within the parameters set by this agreement and make sure that we have a budget that serves the people of our country. In the meantime, there are other things that I continue to work on to try to make sure that our taxpayer dollars are spent effectively and efficiently, that we eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. And that's one of the other things that I continue to work on. I think it's really important for us to actually try to get at that issue without, demanding massive cuts across the board, which is not the way to make government effective.
Are there any examples that you could cite that you might say this is an area where we can do some cutting and it long overdue? I always think when people say, waste, abuse, fraud,
right,
it's almost like a line item, but there's no line item.
Right. So first of all, there are things we have done in the last Congress that are definitely saving the government money. And I'll just start by saying allowing Medicare to negotiate for prescription drug prices is saving the United States government hundreds of billions of dollars and saving consumers up front, while we also continue to work on getting more generics to market and the like. So there are definitely steps you can take to reduce the deficit and help citizens at the same time, and we did that. There's more work to do on prescription drugs, obviously. I focused on the Homeland Security and Government Oversight Committee on reports that we get from the General Accounting Office, among others, that say, hey, there's a bunch of duplicative programs in the United States government. They all, they started at different times. They were started out of one committee or one sector, but they actually are duplicating quite a bit. And so Senator Paul and I work on that, and we, every year, or every 2 years, we sponsor a bill together that says, why don't we take the GAO duplication report and start acting on it, right? And actually look at these duplicative programs and see if we can streamline them, eliminate some, whatever it may be. The other thing that Senator Paul and I have been working on is a bill that would say to the federal agencies, please identify programs that you think are wasteful or duplicative, and give us a list. Work with the CBO about how you define that and what the parameters are. And then that gives Congress an action item list, right, of actual work we can do to get rid of programs that are no longer effective. Last thing I'll point out, and it'll come as no surprise to a New Hampshire audience, Senator Shaheen and I think that the New Hampshire budgeting process is something the federal government could learn something from. A 2-year budget, and That would allow us to appropriate money in the first year, build the budget, and then in the second year, instead of having to go through that whole budget process again, we could actually evaluate how programs are working and then use that information in the next budget process. And we think that that would make for a more efficient budget. It would also make a more sustainable and predictable budget for people who interact with the federal government or depend on federal funding or have contracts with the federal government.
You know, the legislation that was passed by Congress, as you mentioned, we will not face the debt ceiling debate until 25, which is great, 2 years. But going forward, beyond that, do you think this is something that maybe should be taken out of the hands of Congress and maybe give it to Secretary of Treasury to monitor the debt ceiling? There is legislation in the House to do exactly that.
So look, there's ongoing discussion, and there's been some bipartisan discussion about the issue that the way the debt ceiling works now with needing Congress to weigh in creates this potential cliff and this drama every couple of years when our Constitution is clear that the United States government will honor its debts and pay its debts for money that has already been appropriated and authorized. And so I think that discussion goes on. In the meantime, my focus is on just making sure that we can, in the future, separate out, again, any discussion of the debt ceiling, which applies to, again, already authorized and expended money, and really focus on how we can make sure government is serving its constituents.
You know, the council has heard from many of our members across a wide area of industries that are very, very deeply concerned about the provision of that 2017 tax deduction bill. The bill apparently says that you could amortize your R&D tax deduction over 5 years. Many of the industries are upset.
Right.
They want it 1 year.
Yeah.
You have filed legislation to address that concern. Are you hearing the same thing? And where is the bill today?
Yeah, so first of all, we want to incentivize businesses and industry to do research and development, right? That is the core of our economy. That is innovation. That is progress. That is economic growth, right? So it's something I've worked on as governor when we doubled and made permanent the state R&D tax credit, and now we need to change the provision that you're talking about so that R&D expenses can be fully deducted in the year they were expended. There is huge bipartisan support for this in the Senate. When Senator Young, Republican from Indiana, and I amended one piece of legislation last year with this bill, 97 senators voted for that amendment. So it is a reflection of the strong bipartisan support for the idea. The best way to get this bill over the finish line is to work in a bipartisan way to also find a small but significant expansion of the child tax credit. There are people who say, yes, the R&D tax credit is, tax deductibility is really, really important, but so is expanding the child tax credit, something we did through the rescue plan. We're not talking about replicating that. That was a large expansion. But we know that our communities and our economy and our businesses benefit when children are lifted out of poverty. Their health is better, their education is better, they are a better workforce as they become adults, and there should be a way that we can do both things, help lift kids out of poverty, but also get the full deductibility back of the R&D tax credit. And for a variety of reasons, there are people in the Senate who want to pair those things, and I think we just have to be realistic about that's where this is and find a way forward on both.
Mm-hmm. You know, another issue the New England Council hears from our members regularly is the lack of affordable housing, and not just in the Boston area, but all over New England. It's a huge challenge for employers to attract employees to the region, and seeing there's such a shortage of affordable housing. You recently introduced the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, and just how would that bill address this issue, and what more can we do to address this issue here in New Hampshire and New England?
Yeah, so I hear about this everywhere I go. I've been hearing about it since I was in the state Senate, and the problem has been, we passed legislation when I was in the state Senate to try to address a dearth of workforce housing in this state. Now, and folks in the industry who are in the room will tell me if I've got this right, but we have an under 1% vacancy rate, I think, in our rental market, and also a very low vacancy rate in purchased housing. And a healthy vacancy is somewhere like 5%, right? So we are in a really tough place in New Hampshire, to the point where not only families talk to me about not being able to find an apartment to rent that they can afford, but businesses talk to me about not being able to recruit workforce, because even if somebody can afford to purchase a home at some of our increased prices now, they can't find one to buy. So there are a couple of things. The bill you referenced, which Senator Cantwell is spearheading, would do a 50% increase on the LIHTC low and moderate income housing tax credit. And that's been the major source of building affordable housing in this country for a long time. We just haven't been investing enough in it to generate the kind of increase in housing stock that we need. And this is impacting New Hampshire in particular, but it's also impacting people all across the country. There are other things we can do too. I was just in Bedford last Tuesday to do a ribbon cutting on some new units of affordable low and moderate income housing. It's a great project. The units are beautiful. It's right by Bedford High School. Some of the new tenants are teachers at Bedford High School, and they can walk over there, which is great. Policemen, firefighters, right? But one of the things, and by the way, they use some rescue plan money to do it. But one of the things that has been a challenge is that while we all want there to be local control and transparency, our local processes in New Hampshire just take a long time. So one of the things that the developers talked about is how difficult that can be to navigate. Again, not wanting to take away local control, but wanting to make sure that it's meeting kind of modern time standards. And that's something that I think we can all work on together. It's less of a federal issue, but it is something I try to raise with audiences like this, because so many people out here serve on a planning board or a zoning board or know somebody who does, or you're active in your communities, and figuring out a way to say to a developer, we won't approve that provision in your plan, but you can come back in 2 weeks, not 60 days, with a revised plan, is what we're trying to encourage.
Mm-hmm. Since your time as governor, you've been a leader in the effort to combat the opiate epidemic, and over the last several years, the focus in this fight has shifted, and has shifted significantly to the fentanyl crisis. I know that you and your colleague, Senator Shaheen, have both been deeply engaged in the effort to address this international trafficking of this daily substance. But can you tell us a little more about your work in this area and hopefully some progress that's being made?
Yeah, and I'm gonna try to keep my answer relatively short, and then feel free to follow up, because this is literally something that I could give about a half an hour answer on, because this is such a scourge, and it impacts so many people. I don't think there's a person in New Hampshire who doesn't know somebody who has lost a family member to the opioid crisis, and more recently, particularly to fentanyl. And I meet with families who've lost people all the time. I met with a dad just this last week. I have gone to the funerals of, one funeral I will always remember is for a young woman who relapsed and died of an overdose. And when I got to the funeral, I realized that this was the second daughter this family had lost to the opioid crisis. And so we have to go at this from all sides and all perspectives. I will just start with the demand side. We have made some progress, one, in holding opioid manufacturers and distributors accountable, and regulating the use of opioids through prescriptions in a better way, making sure that the prescribing is happening for an appropriate level of pain and under appropriate supervision. We still probably have some work to do there. We also have made progress in increasing access to treatment. We have, Sarah Shaheen and I worked together to bring significantly more dollars. I think we went from about $5 million to 20 or 30 million for recovery services in New Hampshire. We continue to make sure that we are getting enough funding for that. Lastly, on the demand side, we just passed a bill that finally removes a critical prescribing barrier for doctors so that they can prescribe something called buprenorphine. It is known as medication-assisted treatment. It reduces or eliminates the craving people have for an opioid once they get addicted. It is the gold standard for treatment. Up until January 1st of this year, doctors needed a special waiver from the DEA to prescribe it, so not many doctors did. We are going nationally now because of this legislation from about 150,000 docs prescribing it to about 1.8 million doctors will be able to prescribe it. And that means somebody with addiction can go into their primary care physician and say, can you prescribe this medication for me? That's going to help on the demand side, although we got a lot of work to do with pharmacies and physicians and training and the like. The other side of this, of course, is supply. And the thing about fentanyl is that it is incredibly easy and cheap to make and incredibly easy to smuggle because a tiny, tiny amount of it is so potent. So it is smuggled over the border, both the southern border. Now we're seeing, more activity from the northern border as well as the cartels get more and more creative. About 95% of the fentanyl that we seize is seized in our ports of entry. So it's not coming in over the border between our ports of entry, but it's smuggled in commercial and individual vehicles. So we have deployed more and better technology to detect it at the border. I have pushed for more people at the border. That's what they need more than anything, is more border agents and people at the ports of entry inspecting vehicles. I have traveled now to Mexico as well as China to push their governments to do more. China needs to control the manufacture of precursors, which are the chemical component parts to fentanyl that the cartels then make in places mostly in Mexico right now. We are pushing the Mexican government to do more. They are beginning to acknowledge that this is not just an American problem. And the last thing that the Mexican government has asked from us, which is important, is I have a bill in that would increase the number of inspections and the amount of technology on southbound traffic that is crossing from the United States into Mexico. Why? Because the cartels are supplied with cash and weapons from the United States. And that is one of the things that is fueling this crisis. So if we can deploy more technology and people to inspect southbound traffic to stop the cash and weapons from going to cartels, that also will be important. Last thing I will just let everybody know, well, two last things, and I'm sorry to go on so long about this. The Secretary of State met with a group of us about fentanyl and about what the State Department can do with our international partners here. Obviously, China and Mexico governments need to do more. We need more international partners to really put pressure on China and Mexico, and the Secretary of State has begun to engage, as sadly more of our international partners are seeing the impact of fentanyl in their countries as well. And the public service announcement part of this answer is the following. People need to be really, really clear, especially with young people, adolescents, young adults, that the cartels are now taking a new tack. We are offering more recovery services, which means that people with substance use disorder are seeking recovery and are less of a market for the cartels. So they are beginning to produce counterfeit pills that look like other medication and putting fentanyl into those pills. I met with a dad last week whose son, in a one-time purchase, he thought he was purchasing something else from a friend to deal with anxiety, died from a fentanyl overdose in a pill that was labeled as something else. Young people go on the net to find pills. Young people have friends who say to them, I've just got a little Percocet for you. Please talk to the young people in your lives. If you're going to get medication, you need to do it with a prescription from a doc, and you need to buy it at a pharmacy. Because these pills look real. We are taking action to outlaw the counterfeit pill machines that they use. We're trying to fight this from a law enforcement point of view every which way we can. But people need to know that we are losing people who do not have an ongoing opioid addiction, but think they are buying another pill, and the fentanyl doses in that pill are killing them. So I'm sorry for the sober news here, but it's really, really important that we get the word out.
You know, one positive outcome of the pandemic is that we've seen providers and patients alike embrace telehealth as a valuable tool to expand access to health care services, particularly for patients who live in rural areas. What more can Congress do to support the increased use of telehealth and eliminate any barriers there?
For a long time leading up to the pandemic, I would talk with healthcare providers, and they would say, if we could just get telehealth fully implemented, it would make a big difference. And of course, part of that problem was we didn't have high-speed internet everywhere in New Hampshire or all over the country, so it might work for some people in our state, but not for everybody. And obviously, with the rescue plan and the infrastructure bill providing funding for high-speed internet, we're a lot closer to having the whole state connected. On telehealth, as you know, we have extended most of the flexibilities that we put into place during the pandemic through 2024. We need to go beyond that and make them permanent, and we need to especially focus on the fact that some of the telehealth that we need to authorize is going to be audio only. Think about Medicare beneficiaries who might need therapy, which they can do by phone. They don't necessarily need a full computer setup. We want to make sure that our healthcare providers are being reimbursed for audio only care. And again, on the issue of the opioid epidemic, it's really important that docs be able to prescribe treatment to people with substance use disorder in a telehealth setting. That's going to just, again, expand treatment options and get more people the care they need.
I'm just going to move along because I want to give an opportunity for some of us to ask questions here. But in your capacity as the chair of that Emerging Threats and Spending Oversight Subcommittee, you recently presided over the 10th anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing. Looking at lessons learned for emergency preparedness and homeland security, can you tell us some of the key takeaways of that report?
I thought it was really important as a New Englander, first of all, just to recognize and mark the 10th anniversary of the marathon bombing. I don't know about the rest of you. I remember exactly where I was governor when it happened. I remember exactly where I was. I remember the horror of it, and I remember New Englanders coming together. It's such a celebration of patriotism and pride, the marathon, and that somebody would target it was just inconceivable. But it happened, right? And so as chair of the Emerging Threats Committee, we had 3 witnesses who had been on duty as emergency responders, law enforcement, FBI, and Boston Emergency Response, to talk about lessons learned. And a lot of people really praised the response to the marathon bombing, but there are obviously lessons learned there. And I think they boiled down to a couple of things, or maybe 3. One is it's really important that our emergency responders and their organizations have relationships before the emergency occurs, right? So people need to get to know each other. They need to practice working together. They need to prep and have plans and drill a lot together. And certainly this team had done that. They knew each other. They knew what to do. They knew who to call. And it speaks to the necessity of relationships and practice. The other thing that they really highlighted was the importance of information sharing among and between all different law enforcement and emergency responding agencies. We've gotten better at that over the last decade. There's still work to do. The last thing they really focused on was making sure that we're keeping track of emerging technology and the potential ways terrorists can exploit that technology to harm us, and that's about ongoing training too. Biggest takeaway to me is that it's always important to invest in preparedness. It can be expensive. You hope you never have to use the skills you develop, but you really need those skills to be at top form when an emergency happens.
You know, we're now 16 months into Putin's illegal war against Ukraine. It's cost the lives of tens of thousands and displaced, millions of Ukrainians. And we witnessed last week the destruction of the dam, crucial dam, that has added another hardship to the people of Ukraine. We've provided billions. Some estimates is like $78 billion that we've appropriated. But there are people in Congress that are beginning to question whether there is a limit to what we can provide. And what are you hearing from your colleagues in maintaining assistance to Ukraine?
Right. So Putin's a war criminal, and this invasion is illegal. And what happens next is being looked at by autocrats around the world, China and North Korea and Iran in particular. I will start by saying here's what I hear from constituents in the Live Free or Die state. They tell me that we stand for freedom in New Hampshire, and we should continue to stand with the Ukrainian people in fighting for freedom and self-determination in their sovereign land. And so I think it is essential that we continue to stand with the people of Ukraine. It's incredibly important that we continue to build the alliance that we have built and keep that alliance strong. And what we're beginning to see is some of our partners increase their defense spending and increase their contributions too, because they understand what's at stake. This is about whether we are going to say that you, as an autocrat, can't invade a sovereign nation. And that we will stand for democracies everywhere. And it really is critical that we continue to support the Ukrainian people, letting them drive the strategy of how they win this. We've begun to see the counteroffensive over the last week or two. And I think it is going to continue to be a really difficult and challenging war, but it is one that we need to continue to stand with Ukraine on. The last thing I will note is if Putin were to take Ukraine, the question becomes whether he would continue his aggression elsewhere and whether that would invoke NATO, and that obviously makes the stakes even higher for the United States.
You've developed a reputation for bipartisanship, and you mentioned it earlier, Senator Paul, Senator Young. These are two senators that are Republican, and that she's working across the aisle on issues such as mental health and other issues. In a time when partisanship seems to be at an all-time high in Washington, can you just share a little of your approach and how you build bipartisanship relationships, and how do you find that common ground?
Well, thank you for the question, and I'll start by distinguishing between the noise and the coverage of what happens in Washington and the actual working relationships that we have, because while the discourse in Washington is highly polarized and polarizing, there are real bipartisan relationships, and we've actually had a remarkably productive bipartisan Congress that we just finished. So when you think about the last Congress with a 50-50 Senate and a closely divided House, we passed, I think it's 7 major pieces of legislation in 21 and 22, 5 of which were bipartisan. So Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, Postal Reform, CHIPS and Science Act, Safer Communities Act, the Veterans PACT Act, which gets veterans health care for toxic exposures. And there's at least one other bipartisan bill that I may have skipped there. This is one of the most productive bipartisan Congresses that we have had. So I want people to know that we continue to work together, we continue to build relationships, and we continue to try to do things in a bipartisan way, even if you don't hear about it a lot until the bill gets over the finish line. The debt ceiling compromise that we just all talked about was a big bipartisan piece of legislation. What I try to do is take guidance from the people of New Hampshire. We work together all the time, regardless of political differences. We are friends and neighbors. We roll up our sleeves and we raise money for causes we believe in. We have a large citizen legislature where people work together all the time. And so I just try to remember that if I'm hearing about some things from my constituents, probably my colleagues in other states are too. Americans agree about a lot, and we should talk to each other. I'll say to a colleague, "Are you hearing about this surprise medical bill thing?" Mm-hmm. "Yeah, I am." "Okay, what do you think we could do about it?" That's how Cassidy and I got the surprise medical bill done. Right now, the thing I'm hearing most about is mental health from constituents. There's huge bipartisan interest in helping our country deal with the mental health challenges that our people are faced with. And we did some things in the Safer Communities Act, which was a bipartisan bill on both gun safety and mental health. And I think there's more that we can do. We just had a remarkably moving hearing about that in our Help Committee this week.
So you think that mental health legislation might be next as a bipartisan piece of legislation passing? Yeah,
I think it's likely to be part of a package. But Look, we just had a hearing with the Surgeon General on Thursday, Dr. Murthy, who has issued a report on youth mental health and loneliness. Here's what was remarkable. The hearing room was packed with mostly young people. There was an overflow crowd. You don't see this often in the hallways in the Dirksen building. The line was so long to get into the hearing, they opened an overflow room, and it was all young people. 2021, I'm in Epping visiting with students and administrators and teachers. They've reopened as vaccinations are coming back, are available. And it's a 10-year-old who says to me, after a long discussion about how things are going, "Senator, what are you doing about mental health?" It is a young woman, Laura Lee, who I just spoke with last week, who is trying to raise awareness to kind of help young people learn mental health first aid, because she was driving with a friend. She was at the wheel. Her friend had a panic attack. She didn't know how to help her. So there is a lot of work we can do on everything from regulating social media, which we know has an impact, to making more mental health resources available, and that's something that I think we'll find bipartisan support for.
My last question would be the political question. As you know, the DNC earlier this year decided to strip New Hampshire of its first in the nation primary status with the president's blessing. This decision, needless to say, does not sit well with New Hampshire Democrats for obvious reasons. The deadline for New Hampshire to change its law has come and gone, and the Republicans in the state are on the campaign trail and now moving forward with the primary, still being the first in the nation. How will this impact the primary situation on the Democratic side? Will the president have his name on the ballot when the New Hampshire primary is held?
So I am a huge supporter of the New Hampshire primary. That comes as no surprise to anybody here. And I think it makes better candidates and better presidents, and it's important for our democracy and our country. It's also very reflective of the Granite State character that we pretty much invented the direct citizen participation in the nominating process. It was Granite Staters who said, why do people in back rooms get to decide who our nominee is? Shouldn't citizens actually be able to weigh in and vote on that? And we've been doing it for over 100 years, and we are a perfect state to start the nominating process because of our engagement, because of our size, and because of our microcosms of different communities all throughout the state. So I will continue to make that case to the DNC and to the president, as I have multiple times. As I think you've heard from the entire New Hampshire delegation, we have been very clear with the DNC and the White House that our state law says we're going first, and we're going first. And not only does our state law say that, we think we should. And I hope that the president will put his name on the ballot. I think he would do well here. He has a record of bipartisan achievement that has been moving our economy forward as we recover from the pandemic. And this is not the time we should disrupt the momentum here. But at the end of the day, New Hampshire's going to go first. And I think it's really, really important for the country that we do.
We have time for just a couple of questions. ARP, I think Bev has a question, and Tom has the mic, and just wait for the mic and ask your question.
Thank you. Again, good morning, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
I'm sure you know that New Hampshire is the second oldest state in the country by population age. Yeah. Also having a significant number of retirees, second to that fact. Lately, we've been hearing a lot about Social Security, Medicare. We've been hearing 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, where these things become exhausted. Many of us have been contributing for 50 years or more. Yeah, I'm that old. And Social Security provides an element of financial security for retirees. Medicare provides an element of healthcare confidence for retirees. So as we hear smatterings of people talking about spending cuts and such, what are you hearing and what are you prepared to support to help keep both of these solvent?
So thank you for the question. As I think you probably saw when the president did his State of the Union address earlier this year, in a back and forth with Republican members of Congress, there was this agreement that Social Security and Medicare would stay intact, and that, the way I see this is the way you just expressed it. People have paid into these systems for their entire working lives. They've earned this benefit, they deserve it, and they rely on it. And it provides critical financial stability on the Social Security side and healthcare stability on the Medicare side. One of the steps we have taken to strengthen Medicare is the negotiation provision in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is allowing Medicare finally to be able to negotiate for prescription drugs just the way other volume purchasers do. And that will save the Medicare program significant dollars and strengthen it over time. There's more we can do. There are a number of us who would like to broaden the provisions that allow for this negotiation in Medicare, but this is a really important first step. So are the steps we are taking to lower healthcare costs generally, right? Because the more we can lower overall healthcare costs, the better the Medicare program does. On the Social Security side of things, I have long supported lifting the cap on income where people make contributions into the program. There are other bipartisan efforts to look at ways we can shore up Social Security without, of course, changing benefits for people who have paid into it. And we want to make sure that it's there for the long run. And I think there's growing bipartisan agreement that it should be.
And Christina has a question. New Hampshire Higher Education Assistance Foundation.
Good morning, Senator.
Hi, Christina.
Thank you for joining us today. One thing we haven't talked about today is higher education.
Right.
And so I know you're on the HELP committee. There's a lot of issues around student loan repayment starting. Yeah. The FAFSA simplification that you were really involved in, I know is moving along. So just thoughts on where the priorities are right now around higher education within the HELP committee.
Yeah. So thank you for the question, and thank you, Christina, for your leadership in this area too. A couple of things. One, we want people to be able to get quality, affordable higher education. We also want people to have a variety of pathways to that higher education and to career and job training. So there continues to be focus on increasing the Pell Grant in terms of the amount, as well as making it available for things like apprenticeship programs, so people have more choices that reflect their own priorities. We continue to focus on workforce training partnerships. There were provisions and funding for workforce training partnerships in the CHIPS and Science Act, for instance, focusing on kind of high-tech industry. We continue to focus on early college programs. So New Hampshire has its Running Start program. It would be really good to expand that nationwide and make it a no-cost program in public schools around the country so that people can graduate high school with college credits already in place. It will be accepted at least by public universities. That's going to be a really important factor moving forward as well. And then we want to make sure that student loan repayment plans, especially like the Public Service Forgiveness Plan, are implemented well and clearly with folks. There's a lot we can do to help people enter a career pathway, start earning a living with good training at a good job, and then continue their higher education as they work, which I think is a model that would help both with the affordability aspect of this, as well as help with our workforce shortage, and really help young people find their niche over time.
Tess and then Michael, I think that'll end the program. We'd like to be out at 10 if we could.
Thank you, Senator. Really appreciate it, and really appreciated your depth of knowledge in the opioid misuse and the fentanyl space. Yeah. And as you know, the Community Health Center funding ends, 70% of their funding ends at the end of September, and they serve 30 million patients across the nation. I'm here with Chris McCracken from Amiskeg and Bob McLeod from Midstate, and wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about, from your seat on help and finance, how we can think about growing the support for the health centers, given that they are very strongly suited for the medication-assisted treatment and substance use disorder.
Yeah. Tess, thank you for the question. Thanks to all of our community health centers and your leadership in the state. It's really, really important for people. The good news is that there's widespread support for community health centers in Congress. It's not a partisan issue. The harder news is finding the money to pay for the funding and even increase funding. As you know, when we passed the Surprise Medical Bills Act, we used those savings, which saved the federal government considerable dollars, to help extend funding for the community health centers. As we are working to create other savings in the healthcare system, one of which may likely be in the bill we just passed on pharmacy benefit managers. These are the actors, the middlemen, so to speak, in the pharmaceutical purchasing space. One of the things we did there was also pass legislation that will get generics to market more quickly, which saves the federal government, among others, money. So as we take steps to save money in the healthcare system, I think we will be also having the debate about how to use those savings. And I would think that the community health centers will be one of the top priorities there. It's hard to predict exactly how this is going to go, but I think that all of my colleagues, and I'd say most of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, consider this a priority.
And I see that Michael Skelton, the head of the second most powerful business organization in New Hampshire, BIA, like to ask you. And you had a question, right, Peter? And then that'll be it.
Good morning, Senator. Good to see you.
Good morning.
First, I wanted to thank you for your support of the R&D amortization issue that you spoke about earlier.
Yeah.
We've heard directly from a number of members who are really concerned about the impact of that issue, so hoping that progress can be made on that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about permitting reform, which is also an important issue for us and many of our state chamber peers around the country. with the Inflation Reduction Act last year, there was kind of a second phase of interest within the Senate around permitting reform. I think there was a few elements of the debt ceiling deal that chipped away at it. So I was wondering if you could speak to the continued bipartisan interest on permitting reform as we see the need for clean energy and roads and bridges and transportation and speeding up that federal permitting process.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mike, and thank you for the BIA's work on this issue and so many others. So a couple things. We are still looking at some of the details of the debt ceiling package, but my understanding is it does include some critical permitting reform. What Mike is referring to generally is the whole notion that as we transition to a clean energy economy, we obviously need to be able to do the site permitting in a way that, again, honors citizen and stakeholder engagement and input and local oversight, but also recognizes that you need an answer on your project relatively quickly. And one of the problems with environmental permitting and energy permitting generally is it can run 7 or 8 years, and I don't need to tell this room that time is money, right? So it's really important that we condense that time period. It's my understanding we took important steps forward in the debt ceiling bill. I think the notion was kind of a 2-year period, but we need to drill down on it more, and then we're going to need to hear from stakeholders about their own observations about these provisions or opinions, as well as we implement it, how things are actually unfolding and working on the ground. And I assume we will probably need to make some tweaks here. The good news in all of this is that the Inflation Reduction Act's provisions to attract clean energy investment and accelerate our transition to a clean energy economy are really working. The level of investment in New Hampshire, in the United States, as a result of this bill are extraordinary, to the point where our European allies are kind of mad at us because we're attracting a lot of investment that they were hoping to get. So we're feeling good about the overall structure of the incentives to move us to the clean energy economy that we need and to reduce carbon emissions by about 40% by 2030. But permitting reform is a part of that, to achieve that goal. To achieve that goal and modify climate change and modify the disruptions that we're all feeling from extreme weather, we're going to need to continue to work on permitting reform.
One final question. Peter Rice of the Hanscom Federal Credit Union.
Thank you, Jim. I got a humdinger for the last question.
They're going to give you the...
Peter Rice, Hanscom Federal, and we represent about 10,000 retirees, military retirees, and Department of Defense. In a recent Wallet Hub report, New Hampshire is ranked 6th in the nation as a destination for military retirees specifically to retire. What's behind that success, and what could New England learn from it?
Well, thank you for your work, and thank you to the veterans you represent and to all of the veterans in the room and throughout New Hampshire and the country. And in particular for military veterans, I would, I can go on about the virtues of New Hampshire pretty much forever, as I think everybody in this room can, but we are a beautiful state with wonderful communities where people really look out for each other, work together, and there's lots of opportunities for engagement, right? Whether it's, in a service organization you want to engage in, or volunteer at a school or on a planning board or anything else, and we have some of the best natural resources anywhere, and there's lots to do here. So I think there are a lot of good reasons to come here, but for military veterans in particular, we have about 10% of Granite Staters are veterans. They are a very, very engaged veteran community. And they continue to give back, they continue to serve, and I think people will find peers in the veteran community who care about them and who continue to try to support veterans every way they can. So, whether it's Bike Week, which we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of Bike Week, where there's a lot of effort to raise money for veterans among the groups that participate in Bike Week, or whether it's our veteran service organizations who've been at the forefront nationally in terms of pushing for some critical provisions for veterans. This is a good place to retire to. It is a good place to raise a family in too. So I'll just make, again, don't need to tell anybody here that. But we welcome people here, and it's a great place to live and retire and get involved.
Well, with that, we want to thank the Senator for a very informative conversation, and I think all of us learned so much more of the work that she's doing, but also to thank you for all that you have accomplished in the past, and we just wish you much success as you go forward and in working with your colleagues in the United States Senate.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, everybody.